Students like to say, Dean Burgett's like the Energizer Bunny. You wind him up and he just goes and goes and goes. It's a pleasure to be here. And when I was invited to come, I leapt at the chance to come and see our friends on the south side of Elmwood Avenue because it is so important, the work that you do. I love to talk to students, I love to talk to faculty and to staff, and to first begin by paying my respects to each. And thus, I open by paying my respects to you. And I pay my respects to you because this is a great institution. It's a great university. We're an AAU university, as you probably know, of which there are only 62 in North America, 60 in the United States, and 2 in Canada. So we belong to a very, very exclusive group of institutions of higher education that are research universities. And the work that we do is absolutely essential to the national good, but beyond that, it is essential to the international good as well. So I come first to pay my respects because those of us who are here doing the work, whether faculty or staff, are standing on the shoulders of those who came before us. And that's one of the things I want to talk about, because I have learned that many people don't really know the story of what came before. And it's a fascinating story. But I'll begin, as Martha said, you know, students have often said to me, Dean B., when did you come to the university? And my answer has always been, I came back when the Earth's crust began to cool. And that's the reaction I want. Because it keeps me from giving them a year. Well, recently I took a group of students out to lunch, and one of them said to me, Dean B., when did you come to the university? We already know the answer about the Earth's crust. And I thought, uh-oh, the jig is up. And they sensed my anxiety and tried to comfort me with, don't worry, we won't tell. So I said, oh, all right. I'll just banish my vanity and tell you that I came as a freshman violinist to the Eastman School of Music in 1964. So you can see them doing the math. And one of them looked at me and said, you're older than my father. I said, that's right. And depending upon when your folks had you, I could be your grandfather. And then the student who asked me the question said, Dean B., that's over half a century. That's not something to hide. That's something to celebrate and be proud of. And I thought, out of the mouths of babes, absolutely. So this is my 53rd year of association with the Eastman School, or with the University of Rochester, and you can do the math. And in that time, when you get to this stage of one's association with an institution, you begin to wonder about where it came, what's our story? What's the story of this institution that, first of all, admitted me, second of all, educated and trained me, and then thirdly, turned me loose on the world, and for most of that career here at the university as a faculty member, as a dean, as a senior officer, in its behalf. And so I have spent the last several years in the library, in Rushdie's library, researching where it is we came from, who it is we are, and where it is we came from. And so what I thought I would do is tell you some of the stories from past and present. And I'll go on for a bit and show you some slides of famous people whose names you may have heard, except for those who just arrived yesterday, right? But you will hear these names, and because it is on their shoulders that we stand. The university is 167 years old this year. So where did we start? What was the beginning? Well, any good story begins with once upon a time. So once upon a time, in a small little hamlet called Hamilton, New York, there was a school of higher education called Madison University. Now, Madison University actually had its origins in 1820, but in the 1840s it changed and was known as the Hamilton literary and theological institution. Because back in the 19th century, particularly the first half of the 19th century, institutions of higher education, which almost all of them were sectarian, they were associated with a religious sect, were divided into two categories. There was the literary society, which was the liberal arts school, and then there was the theological institute, which prepared men for the pulpit. It was the seminary. So the Hamilton Literary and Theological Institute, founded in the 1820s in Hamilton, New York, in the 1840s changed its name to Madison University and the Hamilton Theological Institution. Well, there were those in the middle of the 19th century who began to grumble that Hamilton, New York was a backwater, that there was not a future in Hamilton, New York, that bear in mind that by the middle of the 19th century, the United States was moving from its rural and agrarian past to its industrial and urban future. And so one of the trustees at Madison, this man by the name of John Wilder, for whom we have a residence hall named, right? Wilder Hall. He was on the board of trustees at Madison University, and he had the following to say. He said, quote, "We are advocating its removal, Madison, to Rochester, because Rochester was a boom town in those days. We were known as the Flour city, the flour city. Why? Because the Erie Canal had been constructed. And so the agricultural industry were bringing their products up the Erie Canal to Rochester for purposes of milling. So we were a milling town, and it was very, very prosperous. So John Wilder had the following to say. We are advocating its removal, Madison's, on the grounds of its location, its dilapidated buildings, the badness of the roads leading to it, the smallness of its own library, its distance from other large libraries. By the way, we were a Baptist institution, so that's important to remember. The want of patronage from that part of our own denomination who are best off, no patronage from other denominations, its proximity to another literary institution, namely Hamilton College in Clinton, New York. Oh, and I love this one. And when I talk to the Board of Trustees, they all get a sort of red-faced chuckle at it. The incompetence of its local board, and the ability of its faculty, some of whom we fear cannot be retained unless something is done immediately. And so a movement was set afoot to remove Madison University to Rochester, New York. Acrimonious quarreling broke out. And in fact, lawsuits were filed, and the case made its way to the New York State Supreme Court, which ruled, and I've read the ruling, made its way to the Supreme Court, which ruled that Madison University could remain in Hamilton, New York. And it turned on a very obscure detail in the charter for Madison University. So Madison was going to stay there. Oh, by the way, despite Mr. Wilder's complaints about it, Madison did all right, because in the 1890s it changed its name to Colgate, very good, Colgate University, which is a fine and distinguished institution. But this acrimonious quarreling broke out. One Hamilton newspaperman wrote, quote, "If the friends of removal wish to convert the character of Madison University into the wild character which Yale College has attained, let them remove it to Rochester, Utica, or Syracuse, and they will doubtless have a wilder set of young men under their care than they now have." Another wrote that of students, by their senior year, certain youths had grown lax in their personal conduct, self-indulgent, addicted to cards, tobacco, and this is, as a former dean of students, I especially like this last one, and conviviality of Venus and spirituous excitement. What a way to talk about beer and wine, right? But Wilder and his partners and his cohort, the removalists, were not to be denied. And so, indeed, in 1850, they relocated to Rochester, New York, to the United States Hotel. The United States Hotel had been a variety of things. And it's located, as you see here, it says on Buffalo Street, which is now West Main. And this building still stands. Here it is. That is a recent photo of our first home. And if you, it is very near, it's just west of Plymouth Avenue, just west of Plymouth Avenue. And the next time you're driving on West Main Street, if you simply look here, you will see the date 1826, which was the year that it was built. And so on the first floor, we had what were called recitation rooms, or recitation rooms, which were classrooms. Each faculty member had his own room. It was called a recitation room. There was a chapel. There were two sort of forerunners of our fraternity system, the Delphic Society and the Pythonian Society. They were student literary groups. And interestingly enough, on the top floors was housing for students. And this is the front of the building, but it's actually an L shape. There's a back side of the building that is perpendicular to the front, and some of the male students lived there. So our founders must have known that student tradition was important, even though they couldn't have known what the location of this might have meant to students in 2017. But you'll get my drift in just a second. It's just a stone's throw. It's just a stone's throw from Nick's, which continues to be, if you've been around for a while, you know that this is, when I was an undergraduate at Eastman, I came to Nick's. It was not located in this spot, but it was in the general area. So they came to Rochester, and in 1850, November 5th, 1850, one of our first professors, this man, ASA Hall Kendrick, rang the bell. Although our university archivist tells me it probably wasn't Professor Kendrick, it was probably the building janitor, who had a lot of power, actually. But ASA Hall Kendrick, I like to say, rang the bell on November 5th at 12 noon, which enunciated the start of classes. And with 60 students and a faculty of 8, the University of Rochester was born in 1850. Now, ASA Hall Kendrick is very, very important because, and we have Kendrick Road, don't we? And we have a Kendrick Residence Hall. See, now you know, these names are so important. He was professor of Greek, but he was a classics scholar. And so one of the things that he's famous for, was being essentially the president. Our first president was Martin Brewer Anderson, this gentleman. But ASA Hall, we had trouble finding a first president. We've had 10. We had trouble finding the first one because nobody wanted the job. So Professor Kendrick performed the executive functions of the presidency in the first 3 years before Martin Brewer Anderson, our first president, arrived in 1853. So he was very important as nominally the chief executive of this fledgling university from 1850 to 1853. But what he's also famous for is, what is our motto? Meliora. And meliora means ever better. Well, being a classic scholar, there is a line in the 5th book of the Roman poet Ovid's Metamorphoses. There's a line in the 5th book that says the following: Video meliora proboque. I see and understand better things. And he thought, meliora better, or ever better, that works. So in 1851, he took the word meliora, he sort of excised it from the Ovid passage to the faculty in 1851. The faculty thought it was terrific, and they adopted it, and it's been our motto ever since. There's sort of a side story to all of this. I was doing a talk with students in 2010, and I was telling this story about Professor Kendrick and about where meliora comes from. The next day, I got an email from a student, an alumna, from the class of 2010, Laura Zimmerman. Important name to remember because I'm sure someday she'll be a trustee here at the university. So Laura Zimmerman is a name you want to remember. So Laura writes to me and she says, Dean B, that was a great talk. I learned a lot about the university that I never knew. And so I decided, she says, I was a classics major, so I decided to go and look up the Ovid passage myself. And my heart stopped. I thought, OMG, she's going to go and see. I've taken my story from secondary sources. She's going to the horse's mouth. she said, you're absolutely right in her email. She said, there is the passage, video meliora proboque, I see and understand things better, I understand better things. She said, but you didn't cite the whole sentence. And I thought, I knew it, I knew I'd get caught. I knew I'd get caught. There's a second half to the sentence, deteriora sequor, which translates, and I still make bad choices. Thought that was absolutely wonderful. And I wrote back to her to say, you know what? Doesn't that describe the human situation? I mean, who here in this room can say, in all honesty, I see and understand better things and I always made the right decisions? None of us can say that, right? So it was perfect. But it is to this man, Professor Kendrick, that we owe the arrival of, the adoption rather, of our motto. This is Martin Brewer Anderson, our first president, who came to us in 1853. Professor Anderson was an imposing figure, as you can tell. Here he is later in life, but he was very tall, very imposing. And back in those days, when we talked about student life or deans of students, that's who it was. When we talk about advancement, that's who it was. There was not administration as we understand it today. But he had been the editor of a very prominent and very important Baptist journal, and he was persuaded finally to come. But he was a little worried about coming because he didn't think he was the equal of the faculty, although it proved that he was, because he was our president from 1853 to 1888, a 35-year tenure. Of our 10 presidents, 2 of them, Martin Brewer Anderson and Rush Reese, served tenures of 35 years each. But this is what he had to say about higher education. He said, the object of education, I'm quoting him now, was not to produce a man trained at anything in particular. The object was to produce a man, full, rounded, and ready to take on whatever life brought next. The idea of the liberal arts education, that principle, that tenet, continues to be embedded in our values here at the university. I advise freshmen and sophomores. And one of the things I say to my freshmen when they first come, you know, and they're worried about what courses I'm going to take and how am I going to be able to get a job. And I tell them, I'm going to give you 2 Burgett heresies. And they're derived exactly from what Martin Brewer Anderson articulated back in 1853. The first is, your major doesn't matter. And they sort of look at me askance. I say, well, almost. If you want to be an electrical engineer, you better be an engineering major because you ain't touching my pipes and wires unless you got the license. But otherwise, your major does not matter. Oh, well, if my major doesn't matter, what does? And I tell them, you're very privileged to be here. You're very privileged. You are already in an exclusive environment that is preparing you to be future leaders of future leaders of the nation, indeed of the world. And so identifying what you're passionate about, identifying what really revs your motors, what really is stimulating and exciting to you, and what you're good at doing. Passion and ability drive ambition and success. And if Martin Brewer Anderson were here today, he would say that I'm absolutely right about that. It's my education at Eastman. Well, let me tell you a funny little story there. So this regional treasurer arrives at the Eastman School in 1964 from St. Louis, Missouri. I'm a regional treasurer, right? At 17, I was a pretty good violinist. I got into the Eastman School after all. And, you know, in my home community, everybody knew me as the up-and-coming violinist. So I was coming to Rochester, seeing it as a detour on the way to New York and the capitals of the world, where I would metamorphose into a national and who knows, even international treasure. That lasted and I remember going into the practice rooms down at Eastman on the first day that I arrived, and I got my violin out, tuned it up, put the music on the music stand, and began to play. Not only the freshmen were there, of course, and so I left the practice room door open just a little bit. I wanted all within earshot to appreciate this regional treasure that had arrived. So that lasted until the sophomores, juniors, seniors, graduate students, and faculty arrived, at which point my whole notion of talent got radically redefined. I pulled the practice room door shut, locked it, put a piece of paper over the window and the door, and a bag over my head so no one would see who was making all that noise. It was a transformative moment. It was a moment of epiphany, driving me to say, well, you know, the likelihood of my being the nut that eats like Perlman is remote. So what am I going to do? Well, I chose to stay at Eastman. Why? Because I was passionate about it. Why? Because I loved being a musician. I loved playing. I loved talking about music. I could talk about it 24 hours a day, as could all of my friends around me. But if you had told me that 50 years later, I would have had a career, part of a career playing with an orchestra, yes. But I had a career as a university vice president, as a university dean, and as a faculty member who didn't teach the violin, although I did profess the violin, I did teach the violin at Nazareth College for several years, but who would teach the history of jazz and the music of Black Americans. How did that happen? Because I found what I was passionate about and what I was good at doing. And that principle is deeply embedded in what we do here. And we exhort our students, your major doesn't matter. What matters is what you are passionate about and what you are good at doing. Burgett's second heresy is, and I always tell them, don't tell your parents. Don't tell them. And usually I have parents all in the room, right? My second heresy is that you never have a job. Now you know why you can't tell them, because when you cross that stage to pick up your diploma, after this investment, they want to see in big neon letters, J-O-B, J-O-B, J-O-B. But in the sense I intended, I've never had a job. What I've had is a career, a life of work and service in which I've been able to spend time with really capable people, really smart people, like Martha Crone, for example, with Christina. Where is she? Where's Christina? I was her dean of students. Yes, I was. I was her dean of students, wasn't I? And you were a good kid too, weren't you? You never got one of those letters saying, see me, right? Where I get to spend time with really smart and capable people like you. And at the end of every month, they give me money. If you want to call that a job, of course I have a job. But what we exhort our students, and we have from the beginning, is to think of themselves in a much larger way, in a much, much, much bigger way than something that only a parochial notion of I've got to have a major that's going to get me a job. So if you want a job, go look in the want ads, because your career will be driven by what you're passionate about and what you are good at doing. And then another principle that drives what we do here, particularly at the undergraduate level, I'm getting a little away from the history right now, but I'll get back to it, is for Rochester students, and this is for students at institutions like ours. It's not that we're that different, but these ideas are important. Careers evolve. Well, if not getting a job, Dean Burgett, what do you mean? Careers evolve, and you're limited principally by three factors. One, your capacity to invent. Two, your willingness to work. And three, a little luck. Capacity to invent means dreaming the thing up. I tell this to students all the time. Dreaming the thing up. Look, unless they ask you to perform brain surgery, the answer has to be yes. Why? Because you have a degree from a major research university. You know how to learn. Back in the days when I graduated from Eastman, the Vietnam War was raging. It was a terrible time, and we had a military draft. You didn't want to get drafted because you sort of lost control over what might happen to you. And so I discovered, because my deferment as a student was up, so I learned that there was an Army band in Rochester, New York. I thought, I got to get in this band. So I went to the band headquarters, and a good friend of mine, a classmate of mine at Eastman by the name of Jerry Nywood, some of you may recognize that name, now the late Jerry Nywood, he's no longer with us, was killed in that plane crash in Clarence, New York about 5 years ago. Jerry was in the band. Saxophonist. I said, Jerry, you got to get me in this band, man, because I'm about to get drafted. He looked at me and he said, Paul, you're a violinist. I said, yes, but I played the flute in high school. He said, oh, I didn't know that. You played the flute? And I said, yeah, in my high school band, I played flute. So he said, well, I don't know what I'll see what I can do. So I don't know what kind of lies he told, or arms he twisted, or bribes he paid. But the next thing I knew, I was in the 98th Division Army Reserve Band. So I go to basic training, do all of that, come back to Rochester, report for duty. The commanding officer looks at me and he says, Burgett, I'd never met this man. He says, Burgett, I don't need another flute player. He said, I need a tuba player. I said, sir, I don't play the tuba. He said, aren't you a graduate of the Eastman School? I said, yes, sir. He said, well, there's the tuba. And then it hit me. This is a marching band. I need 2 notes. Oomph and pa. I became the best mediocre tuba player that band had ever seen. He didn't tell me he needed an F-16 fighter pilot. He needed a tuba player to pipe out 2 notes. I said, you watch me do that. And that's the message for our students. The kind of flexibility, your capacity to invent, to dream it up. I mean, I could have said, no, sir, I just can't do that. And he said, well, there's a tank. You can go drive the tank. I don't want to drive a tank. Your willingness to work means you got to know the notes. You just have to know the notes. And that's one of the qualities we talk about. We talk about education of the highest order, and it goes all the way back to Martin Brewer Anderson. We're talking about pushing the envelope to its limits and then going beyond that, because it has to be the highest quality. It is no accident that our medical center has the tagline, medicine of the highest order. That didn't get invented last year or the year before. That got invented in 1924 when the medical center was created. And it was George Eastman who came up with the idea that it was going to be medicine of the highest order, is what we were going to call it. So, but in order to do that, you got to know the notes. You got to do the problem sets. There's no way around it. There's no shucking and jiving in terms of the pursuit of quality. And finally, a little luck, as I tell students. Luck is not luck like winning the lottery, because we all have enough statistics to understand that. And some experience. I used to buy those things. Luck is being in the right place at the right time and knowing it. That's critical, being in the right place at the right time and knowing it. Those ideas, passion and ability drive ambition and success, and then one's capacity to invent, one's willingness to work, and being in the right place at the right time, are all principles that I have distilled from the history of the university that I think are fundamental values and fundamental principles about this place. So Martin Brewer Anderson came. By the way, he came in '53, and he hated residence halls. He thought residence halls were just the bane. In fact, he referred to them, herding students in one building afforded every facility for the propagation of evil principles and habits. Let me tell you, as a former dean of students, I know exactly what President Anderson was talking about. Okay? So, ain't nothing new. You know, they say there really is nothing new. So, he was also opposed to sports. I mean, we did have baseball. That was the national pastime, of course. But he saw the organized sports. The physical violence and hazing was rampant in most colleges at the time, which is true. And he saw organized sport as a grave evil and an outcome of popular muscular Christianity and the glorification of physical strength among the young. So that was his attitude. So we had baseball. Football did not come to us until after he had left. Now, does anybody know who this is? Chester Dewey, for whom Dewey Hall is named. Chester Dewey was a very distinguished natural scientist who was actually the headmaster of an elite high school here in Rochester, New York. And he was one of our first faculty members, as was ASA Hall Kendrick. So he taught in the natural sciences. You see, back in those days, chemistry and physics and biology and biochem, and they weren't as distinctive disciplines as they are today. And so physics, and so they weren't as distinct, and so they all sort of fell under the rubric of natural sciences. But he was very famous. He was nationally known, but based here in Rochester. He did not come from Madison University. And you know, I take a look at that picture and I think to myself, if I walked into a classroom and saw that, I'm not sure I would want to take that course. Because he probably would hit you, you know. I mean, back in those days, you know, bend over, Burgett, you didn't get the problems right. But I figure he must have had a soft spot in his heart for students because he sired 15 children. So that's Chester Dewey. And here's a picture from the 1880s of some of our earliest faculty members, Albert Mixer, modern languages. Here's ASA Hall Kendrick. This is President Anderson. This is Isaac Quinby, professor of mathematics, who fought in the Civil War. He was a general for the Union and fought in the Civil War. This is Samuel Lattimore. Samuel Lattimore, who was an important chemist, and Professor Lattimore, for whom we have a building named, was a consultant to George Eastman for the chemical processes. This is William Morey. William Morey, for whom we have a building named, was professor of political science and history. This is Joseph Gilmore, who was professor of English and rhetoric. And this is Otis Robinson, who was our first librarian, a professional librarian. Interestingly enough, in our early days, ASA Hall Kendrick, you know, you performed the function, whatever was needed, you did it. But Otis Robinson was our first. Now, how much time do I have? Oh, I have to hurry. Because this part of the story is really, really fabulous. And it's something to know. This is Azariah Booty. And we actually have a song called The Dandelion Yellow in the University Songbook featuring Azariah Booty and his cows. Now, Azariah Booty was a very prominent businessman here in Rochester, but he was also a trustee of the university. He lived on East Avenue, and I'll tell you where he lived. If you picture East Avenue, across the street from the Jewish Federation, you know where that is, Sibley Place, the Jewish Federation, there is a red Greek Revival home, one of three that remains on East Avenue, that was the home of the Boy Scout headquarters. You know where I'm referring now. So ASA Hall Kendrick, or rather Azariah Booty, owned that house. Before that, there were people like Daniel Powers of the Powers Building owned it before Booty, and before Powers, William Pitkin, another businessman who built that house. So the houses on East Avenue extended all the way back to University Avenue. Why? Because we didn't have Wegmans in those days, right? Right? And so these were gentlemen farmers, and so they had to grow their own food, they had to cultivate their own livestock, and so Azariah Booty, very well known, there's a young picture of him, and so he owned the land all the way back, including the land that we know as Pitkin's Woods, named for the builder of the house. Pitkin's Woods is a 25-acre plot of land that we now know as the old Prince Street campus. Or it's called the Old Campus or the Prince Street campus. Because in 1861, we were in the United States Hotel from 1850 to 1861. In 1861, we were bursting at the seams, and so Azariah Booty helped to make it available to us. The 25 acres bound by Prince Street, University Avenue, Goodman Street, and College Avenue. That's 25 acres. Now, what you don't know, and what most people don't know, is that the idea of higher education for women was born Rochester was born in 1852. Women were not admitted to the University of Rochester until 1900. We know that, and I'll get to that in a moment. But Azariah Booty and ASA Hall Kendrick and John Wilder and a few other University of Rochester people got together to create something called Barley Wood Female University. And Azariah Booty donated 8 acres of those 25 acres for the creation of Barley Wood. It was a separate corporation, and it was going to be for the higher education of women. The initiative failed for lack of funds. And so, in fact, I've read the minutes of the corporation's board meetings. There were only 3. They held only 3 meetings. They were not able to raise the money in 1852, and so the idea existed 1852, 1853. But there was so much pressure on raising money for this fledgling University of Rochester that the idea went away. But what's important about mentioning it is that the idea existed about the education of women existed shortly after our founding. Now, it would be a separate institution because higher education in those days, with the exception of Oberlin College, higher education was not co-ed. If there was to be an institution for women, it would be in a separate. So the notion of the coordinate colleges existed with some real force into the late 19th and early 20th century. So that's why we see Hobart and William Smith, Harvard and Radcliffe, Duke and Trinity, Columbia and Barnard. So Barley Wood didn't come to fruition. Oh, one other thing I should mention that's important for you to know. Pitkins Woods, before the university took it over as its Prince Street campus, and it had been a grazing area. It was used for grazing of the livestock. And the spring growth on Pitkins Woods would have been the dandelion. Thus the university's flower comes from Pitkins Woods, okay? So Barley Wood failed, and Booty donated those 8 acres to the university, and then through a series of very complex and complicated transactions, the university acquired the other 17 acres, creating the Prince Street campus, and we moved there in 1861. Oh, by the way, Prince Street, you know, there's Prince Street, and we call the Prince Street campus. So where does that name come from? Well, I'll tell you. Prince was the name of Azariah Booty's favorite horse. So now you know the rest of the story. So that's Azariah Booty. Lewis Henry Morgan, very, very important. He was a lawyer who really didn't practice law. He was very well-to-do. He was never a faculty member here, but he was thought of as at the same level intellectually as our other faculty members. And he was a prime mover behind the creation of Barley Wood Female University. So it's a very, very important name. He's buried in Mount Hope Cemetery. So in 1861, we moved to the Prince Street campus, and I love this photo. This photo has to be taken after 1905 because we can see here the statue of Martin Brewer Anderson, and it was installed there in 1905. I don't have a date for this photograph, but I love the sylvan setting. You know, it's a very, very beautiful setting. Here's the statue today as it stands between Burton and Crosby residence halls on the lower quad on the river campus. And here is a postcard of Anderson Hall named for Martin Brewer Anderson. And everything was done in there. I mean, it was the first building, and everything was done in that building, which caused some real problems, because you can imagine the chemistry laboratory, fumes and what have you, wafting into a class in philosophy, all of which was exacerbated by mischievous students doing crazy things to exacerbate the problem. This is the building as it looks today, and it is the corporate headquarters of the United Way. The front of the entrance to the building is around on College Avenue, but if you pull in and to the backside, you will see over the doorway atop the canopy there, Anderson, named for President Anderson. This was our second building. Now this is Sibley Hall. Now Sibley Hall, how much time have I got? Sibley Hall is very, very important. It was our first library. It was our first fireproof building. It was made possible by a gift. It was 1874, the gift was made. I think over the doorway it said 1877. When I came as a student, this building still stood. It was raised in 1968. But this was a gift made possible by Hiram Sibley. Now, when we think of the university's benefactors, we think, of course, of George Eastman, obviously. Hiram Sibley was to the 19th century what George Eastman was to the 20th century. Hiram Sibley was the founder of Western Union Telegraph. He was the founder together with his partner. So he was the founder together with his partner of Western Union. And if you picture the corner of East Avenue and Alexander Street, the building, one of the buildings on on the southwest corner, if you look at the top, it says the Sibley building. That was Hiram's building. And that's where his offices were. His mansion still stands. You know where East Avenue Inns and Suites are? Right next to East Avenue Inns and Suites, across the street from the Genesee Valley Club, is the Hiram Sibley Mansion. And if you look at the gates that at the entranceway, at the sidewalk, you will see the letters HS in the pillars of the gates there. Very, very important. He had two philanthropic loves. His largest philanthropic love was Cornell, because he endowed their engineering school. So it is the Sibley School of Engineering and Applied Sciences. But he also provided resources for the University of Rochester's first library. Now, this is the old man's son. And he was a lawyer. And Hiram Sibley, the elder, had two children, Emily Sibley Watson and Hiram Watson Sibley. Gets confusing when you think about all that, but I'm going to explain why, because people will ask you about this. So he had two children. So, and they were roughly comparable, and they were separated by about a year in age. Emily died at the age of, or rather, no, they had two children, Louise and, Emily and Hiram Watson Sibley. They had those two children, the elder. And the elder wanted his son to take over the business, but the son was living in New York because he didn't want to live in Rochester. So the elder built a mansion right at the corner of Alexander and East Avenue, where East Avenue Inns and Suites are. So there was a home that he built there. And Hiram Watson Sibley is important to us because one of the great music libraries on the planet is the Sibley Music Library. It's not the elder who did it, it's the son who did it. And so Hiram Watson Sibley was a collector of music and books on music, and he donated his collection to the University of Rochester in 1904. And at that point, it was housed in Sibley Hall on the Prince Street campus, available to all university students. The Eastman School hadn't been invented yet, as well as the public. And then he also provided something like a $50,000 endowment for future collections and that sort of thing. So he's very important. Now, one thing that's very interesting, notice the W for Watson. So where does that come from? Well, Hiram the Elder's partner in the creation of Western Union was Don Alonzo Watson, for whom we have a professorship in political science named the Don Alonzo Watson Professorship in Political Science in the College of Arts and Sciences. So Don Alonzo Watson was Hiram's partner. And to cement their relationship, their business relationship, each man agreed, they agreed together that the firstborn son of each would take as his middle name the surname of the partner. So Hiram's son became Hiram Watson Sibley, and Don Alonzo's son, James, became James Sibley Watson. Now, Hiram also had a daughter, Emily Sibley. And Emily married a businessman by the name of Isaac Averill, and that relationship produced two children. It produced Louise, who died at the age of 8, much to Emily's great tragedy, and James G. Averill. And he died at 26. And death in those days from infectious diseases like typhoid and cholera were common, right? We didn't have the sanitation then that we do now. It was devastating to Emily when that happened. So her marriage to Isaac didn't last. He was sent packing. But Emily, of course, because the Watson family and the Sibley family were very close. So Emily, of course, knew James. So they got together. And we see a marriage between James Sibley Watson and his wife, who became Emily Sibley Watson. And thus have I removed the confusion, because the confusion has existed forever about what's all this Watson Sibley stuff I see everywhere. So anyway, that's the Sibley Music Library. It is to the son that we owe that collection. Now, in the original Sibley Hall, you see these statues in the niches here. They're referred to as the Muses. They really aren't. They are female statues that were done in Italy of things like commerce and agriculture, fields of endeavor, of intellectual and practical endeavor. And there were 4 on this side, and there were to be 4 on the other side. A couple were lost in transit. And also in the front of the building are 2 sphinxes guarding the entrance into the library. And the sphinxes still exist, so when this is off the residence quad going into the tunnels. So you will see the sphinxes, they still exist. I've never been crazy about that location, but we have yet to find a better one. And then the madams, as they're sometimes referred to, are between Meliora Hall and Reynolds Library over here. And I love this because clearly these sisters, it must have been some conversation. You know, these two, you know, they're walking wherever they're going. This one's just turned her back on the whole thing. And the source of the trouble is obvious. Right? The source of the trouble is really obvious. So anyway, and there's a 5th one that just came to us last year, commerce. And if you just imagine between Schlegel Hall and Dewey Hall, there's a new statue there, because one of our alums from years and years ago, somehow the university gave it to him, and he's from Toronto, so he took it up to Toronto. I think he's a lawyer or a doctor, I forget now. But last year he wrote to say, he's quite advanced in age, so last year he wrote to us to say, I've got her, and but I'm downsizing, you know, and I don't know what to do with her. Do you guys want her back? So of course we said, yeah, we want her back. So she came back, and so to avoid any problems that existed here, we put her between Schlegel and Dewey. So the next time, I think it's Commerce is her name. So the next time you're walking through the passageway between Schlegel and Dewey, you will see her. These are just images of the inside of Sibley Hall. And I love this. I mean, we don't build buildings like this anymore. Again, that's Sibley Hall. This is the 2nd floor of Sibley Hall, which contained one of the world's finest mineral and fossil specimens that were the product of Professor Fairchild. And Professor Fairchild, for whom we have a residence hall named. This collection was just absolutely spectacular. It's sort of been split up and sold off, and we don't have very much of it anymore. Very quickly, this is Reynolds Laboratory. Remember, we were doing everything in Anderson Hall. So in the 1880s, this was built thanks to a gift from William Reynolds, who was a tobacconist, and this was all just for chemistry. In 1888, President Anderson retired, and he died in 1890. And our second president was David Jane Hill. David Jane Hill came very, very young, as you can see, and he was important. He was the fulcrum between Martin Brewer Anderson, who sort of helped get us started and stabilize the university in a 19th century tradition, and Rush Rees, who came in 1900, Rush Rees ushered the university into the 20th century. He served the shortest presidency of any, only from 1889 to 1896. But what was important was that the idea of the admission of women began to take on real force. He's noted to have said, if the male and the female can coexist in the womb for 9 months, I see no reason why they can't coexist in the classroom. Also, football came to Rochester in 1889, his first year, and we actually had an athletic league that included Union College and Ithaca College and Syracuse and Union, I may have mentioned it, and Princeton. And our first football match in 1889 The score was Union 46, Rochester 0. Not a very auspicious beginning, but our second match was against Syracuse. Score, Rochester 36, Syracuse 0. We would not get that result today, but in any event, he was a much more open-minded, and he really did open the doors and windows of the academic enterprise, introducing greater numbers of courses and allowing greater flexibility on the part of students to make their own choices for what they were going to study. Our first African-American graduate, Charles Augustus Thompson, graduated in 1892, then went on to become a Presbyterian minister and a chiropractor. Being a physician, if you were a person of color, and getting into medical school was very, very difficult, if not impossible. So he went to Howard University in Washington, studied chiropractic, and lived out a very distinguished career. Rush Reese, arguably the greatest president, and I mean no disrespect to any of the presidents that we've had, but Rush Reese served for 35 years, and I'm going to wind up so I can answer a few questions. I'm going to end up with Rush Reese. What did he do? He came to us in 1900. We see women admitted to the university in 1900. Susan B. Anthony in 1898 had gone to the trustees and said, this is while David Jane Hill had left, we had an interim president. She went to the trustees and said, we must move on admitting women because there's no place for women to have the kind of education that the men have. So the trustees laid down the following challenge. If you can raise $100,000, which is, I don't know, in 1898, the equivalent of what, $10 million? If you can raise $100,000 in 2 years, we'll consider adopting a resolution to admit women. Miss Anthony said essentially failure is impossible, and went about the business of raising this $100,000. By the deadline that the trustees had set, they had raised only $40,000. So Ms. Anthony went back to the trustees to renegotiate the terms. The trustees agreed to reduce the goal to $50,000. And Ms. Anthony says raising that additional $10,000 was harder than raising the first 40 because they had tapped everybody out, right? But they were able to find 3 or 4 people, including Susan B. Anthony's sister, Mary Gannett, who was the wife of a prominent Unitarian minister, and a few other people to come up with the additional $10,000. And in 1900, the board adopted a resolution admitting women. Now, one of those gifts of that $10,000, the trustees decided was uncollectible. So they were hesitant about adopting the resolution. Miss Anthony had been in Detroit on a suffragist trip. She came back, learned that this enterprise might fail, got out of her sickbed over on Madison Street in her home, came to the board meeting, which would have been in Anderson Hall on Prince Street, and to put her money where her mouth was, she surrendered the cash value of her whole life insurance policy, which then was valued at $2,000, which took them to the $50,000 goal. And the board then adopted the resolution. Now I'm going to tell you something that the advancement people tell me, Paul, please don't tell them this. So don't tell Tom Farrell or Steve Dare that I told you this. The campaign for women continued beyond the 50K, and so the trustees gave her life insurance back, right? A very gentlemanly thing and right thing to do, in my view, as I point out to my colleagues Farrell and Dare. So women were admitted in 1900, thanks to the efforts of the great Susan B. Anthony. Our first graduate was Ella Salome Wilcox, and this is a picture of her as a very young girl. They were in Anderson Hall. They were accorded one room, just one room only, where they had to do all their studying, their eating their lunch, and all the rest of it. Here's a photo from the class of '04, the basketball team. I love this photo, but I love especially the photo that follows. Here they are celebrating their, I think it's their 50th reunion. 04, because this is a photo from 1954. So here they are, and it's most of the women in the class. So it's really very wonderful. And they're actually, one of the women was asked to write about what life was like as a member of the entering class, and it's a very poignant narrative, journalistic narrative that she provided us that we actually have, but I don't have time to read that to you now. In 1910, the first dean of the College for Women, Annette Gardner Monroe, for whom we have a residence hall, arrived, and she was the first dean until the late 20s. This is our first woman professor, Annette Denio, who taught art and art history, she was really quite distinguished, and she actually started teaching at Rochester in 1902 without benefit of salary. The students would collect money to pay her. But in 1910, President Reese accorded her faculty rank and a salary. And so she continued as professor of art and art history from 1910 until 1917 when she retired. And then, ironically and sadly, she was killed in an automobile accident at the corner of Meigs and East Avenue by Third Pres. Our first African-American woman graduate from 1932 is Beatrice Amaza Howard. This was our first gymnasium, and I'll just tell you that this was located about where Cutler Union is now. You know where Cutler is. This was our first, and it was in this building, which was constructed in 1900, that President Rush Reese was inaugurated. Oh, this is really an interesting story. So women I just love this stuff. So in 1900, women were admitted, and we actually existed as a coeducational institution. The men and women were taking classes together. But as I'd mentioned earlier, the idea of coeducation did not exist with any real force. The idea of the coordinate college. So in 1912, the university trustees adopted a resolution creating a separate college for men and college for women. In 1914, these two buildings, which still stand, and if you know that area, you know that that's the corner of Prince and University Avenues. So these two buildings, this is Catherine Strong Hall, named for the mother of Henry Alva Strong, for whom Strong Memorial Hospital is named. And so Catherine Strong was the location of classrooms for women, and the dean's office was here. And the idea was, did men and women, were there any classes they took together? Yes, there were. Art and art history, no problem. English, no problem. Anatomy and physiology, I don't think so. Okay? But it was, you have to understand it was the times. So this is Catherine Strong Hall, and then this, which is attached with this cloister here, this is the Anthony Memorial Gymnasium, which was just sold, I understand. And it was named for Susan B. and her sister Mary. And this is what it looks like today. Housing for men was a real problem. This is the corner of Strathallan and University Avenue. This building no longer stands. This was the fraternity house for Delta Upsilon. And the fraternities, our early fraternities were Delta Upsilon, Deke, Psi U, Alpha Delta Phi was our first fraternity, actually. So those were our first major fraternities, and DU had its house at the corner of Strathallan and East Avenue. It's raised now to give you, it tees into the Memorial Art Gallery. So, and now what's at that location are 4 condos that were built maybe 20 years ago. I've told you a little bit of the story of it was Emily Sibley Watson who agreed to the creation in 1913 of the Memorial Art Gallery as a tribute to her son J.G. Averill, who died at the age of 26 of typhoid. And this is a picture of Emily. James Gould Cutler. Gould Cutler was a prominent citizen businessman, served in the House of Representatives, the Federal House of Representatives, and he is, anybody know what his claim to fame is? Mail chute? Yes, the mail chute. So when you go into old buildings, on the first floor you see the big brass box. James Gould Cutler invented that because someone had said to him, you know, it's a real pain in the neck when you're on the 35th floor, and your office is on the 35th floor, and you got to get the mail down. So he put the problem into action and created the Cutler mail chute, which then was in buildings all over the world. So he made the gift to create the Cutler Union for the women after the men had moved to the River campus. George Eastman, and again, I'm out of time, but because I know you have to go. But just let me say a couple of words about Eastman and Rush Reese. George Eastman was not an educated man. He's from Waterville, New York. His father was a reasonably prosperous businessman who died when George was in high school. So Mr. Eastman left high school. They had moved to Rochester, and he took up a variety of jobs with the bank and what have you. But he was really interested in chemistry. And the idea of photography appealed to him, and he saw an opportunity. And what precipitated his seeing this opportunity was he had planned to make a trip to Europe. And a friend of his had said, well, why don't you take camera equipment, the photographic equipment for the trip? And so Mr. Eastman went and he bought all this stuff. I mean, it would fill this room, you know, with all kinds of pots and pans and stands and stuff. And he realized that there was an opportunity here for an entrepreneurial opportunity for the common person, if he could figure out how to create the form whereby people didn't have to carry all this stuff and do the chemistry themselves. And thus was the Brownie camera born. You snap the picture, we'll do the rest, was what it was called. And the dry plate company was created where you had the box, and the box came when you bought it with film already in it. You took the 20 or so photos, and then you mailed the whole box to the company. The company took the film out, developed it, put a new roll of film in, and sent you the box back, the camera back with your photos. It spread like wildfire. George Eastman did not invent photography, but what he did do was create photography for the people. That was his claim to fame. Well, when President Reese became the president in 1900, I think he immediately recognized that George Eastman, who was already successful, his relationship with George Eastman was central to the success of the University of Rochester, and thus began a relationship. Mr. Eastman's first gift to the university in 1899 was a camera, a Brownie camera, which he gave to Herman Leroy Fairchild, our professor of geology, for research that he was doing. But in 1904, President Reese went to him because we needed a new physics and biology building, a building that still stands today on the Prince Street campus. And it cost $75,000 to construct and outfit. So he was hoping that Mr. Eastman would go along with that, and he went to him for a gift, and Mr. Eastman gave him a check for $10,000. Well, President Reese was disappointed, and apparently Mr. Eastman recognized that and called him on it. So President Reese said, oh no, he assured him that he was really pleased and grateful for this gift, and he would use it to leverage future gifts to build his physics and biology building, and took his leave. The next day, President Reese received on his desk a check for $65,000 and to cover the cost. And Mr. Eastman is alleged to have said, I did this because he did, and by the way, don't tell Tom this, and don't tell Steve this, whatever you do, don't. So he said, I gave him the money because he didn't nag me for it. Number one, and number two, this is my first and last gift to the university. And as you know, by the end of his life, on March 14th, 1932, when he took his own life at his mansion, that morning he called his attorneys to the mansion, and he added a codicil to his will, leaving the balance of the residue of his estate to the University of Rochester, which at that time was about $17 million. And then he, with a single shot, took his life about midday in his bedroom at the mansion. When we aggregate all of Mr. Eastman's gifts from the very beginning, from that 1904 gift to 1932, it's about $51 million. If you adjust that to inflation, it's over $800 million, making Mr. Eastman arguably the largest and most generous individual contributor to higher education in American higher education. And during this period of the Reese presidency, we see the Eastman School of Music created. The 1920s is the most astonishing decade in the history of the university, in my view. We see the creation of the Eastman School of Music. We see the creation of the medical school, the School of Medicine and Dentistry, and Strong Memorial Hospital. We see the first PhD in 1925 in biochemistry, the second and third PhDs in biochemistry in 1927, one of whom, Vincent Duvigneau, won the Nobel Prize the following decade. We see the creation of the Institute of Optics in 1929, and in 1930 we see the move of the College for Men, located still on the Prince Street campus, to the River campus. And the amazing, if you will, the river campus originally was what? Oak Hill Country Club, right. We acquired it thanks to the finagling of George Todd, who was a prominent businessman here in town. And so that deal was finally concluded in 1924. Imagine this, if you will. You got the Eastman School underway, you got the School of Medicine and Dentistry and Hospital underway, the Institute of Optics underway. Between 1927 and 1930, the river campus was leveled and prepared so that in 1930, the College for Men moved to the river campus. It's absolutely astonishing. I'm sure that President Reese, who said the first third of his presidency was horrible, the second third things improved appreciably, and the third things happened in a very, very big and important way. So I'm out of time. I'm over time. It's almost 10 past. So you'll have to invite me back to hear the rest of the story. For those, some have to go, of course, but if there are one or two questions that people have, I'd be happy to try to answer them. Yes?
Do you have any idea what the tuition and room and board fees were for the inaugural class?
In 1850? I think it was $25 tuition, and room and board was like $2.50. I mean, it was that I don't know if those numbers are exactly right, but that's the order of magnitude. Well, thank you, and I'll be happy to come again if you would like.